What's up everybody, Josh Smith here. Today I'm going to share with you a way to make integrated mockups for any of your product designs. Let's jump in. So here I have my original rectangle. I just went ahead and put that into the picture. Just made a rectangle with my rectangle tool and then turned that into a smart object. Double clicking on the smart object can take me to the interior of the smart object where I can put my artwork, and then I just masked out the outer edges and covered up painting with black to cover up parts of the bottom edge of the album underneath this iPad here and underneath this camera. Then of course I needed to add a little bit of shadow elements to make it look like it was still standing up from the table just slightly. I went ahead and added some dings and scratches and tears on the edges with some white brushes, put those into a folder and copied that mask in onto the folder to be able to contain those things, and just kind of had fun throwing in a few scratches and things, trying to use many different kinds of brushes to make it look a little bit more realistic. Next I added some shadows underneath and on top of the album cover, but underneath the iPad and the camera in this photograph. And then I needed to add a little bit of light onto my album here to make it look a little bit more realistic. So I deepened some shadows in some areas and added some highlights out towards the edges. Then I thought maybe it might be fun to brighten the whole picture just a little bit, kind of adding some Lightroom effects a little bit here, just doing those in Photoshop with some large brushes. These are just paint that I then changed the blending mode on and the opacity. And I added a few of those just for good measure, just brighten up the photograph a little bit. So here I've got two things open. I've got the photograph that I want to mock up into, and I have my album cover that I designed and drew and ready for that to go into it. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and go over to my shape layer, create a rectangle that I can use as a smart object to be able to integrate into that space. I'm going to try and create this rectangle approximately the same size as my designs. And in this case, since they're both square, they're also the same size as the album that I'm mocking up into. So I'm going to go ahead and create one of those. Now the contents of this particular square don't matter at all. In fact, I can turn them all off. That's fine, or I could just use kind of a placeholder color that's going to be close to the color that I'm going to be designing with. And I can just do something like that. Let's do something softer. Yeah. Next thing I want to do is make this a smart object. So step 2, I need to create this. After I've created this rectangle, is to then make it a smart object. I can right click on the layer and then just choose convert to smart object. When I do that, it's going to change the properties of the object and give me a little bit more control to be able to put that album cover in there. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. You should see the symbol change on the layers panel here. And now I can distort this rectangle. And the nice thing about distorting the rectangle instead of distorting my artwork is that nothing's going to get squished or pulled or anything like that. Now you can tell first of all that I know that I did this correctly by just double clicking into this picture plane where that smart object symbol is in the layers panel. If I double click there, it's going to take me to a new document, a new window within Photoshop that I can tell is a .psb. That's my inside of the smart object itself. And you can tell I did this correctly because it is still the same square object that I created initially. If something looks a little weird or funky, it may be that you distorted the square before you made it a smart object. You do have to do this in the correct order. So I'm just going to close this for now and come back to it later, and I'm going to go ahead and distort this square into the shape of this record album here. So let's go to Edit and Distort, and now I can just pull the corners where I want them to go. I am overlapping beyond and past some of the edges of this album. It is bent a little bit in some places, and the corners are kind of tucked in and kind of been knocked around a little bit, so they're not perfectly sharp and rectangular, which is good. That's good. We want it to look a little bit more natural. So I'm just going to extend this a little bit further out, and what I'll do is create a mask around the outside edge of this mock-up so that then I can make sure that it looks real and fits perfectly into what this lady's holding. Go ahead and hit enter to accept that transformation. And then I'm going to go ahead and put my album cover into this space. Again, I just need to double click into this picture plane, 2 clicks, go over to my album cover art that is finished. I'm going to go ahead and flatten this temporarily. Now it's flattened, I can just drag this layer over to my new rectangle1.psb and then keep dragging, come down with it and drop it off. I do need to make this a little bit bigger to fit into the space. And we'll just center it up so it fits. Make sure everything can be seen. And what we want to do now is save this. So Command S or go to File and Save, not Save As. If you choose Save As, you will be effectively changing the location of the smart object and it won't be linked into your original document here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit regular save, Command S, and I'm going to go back to my document here, and there it is. So it's all mocked up in there. It's now actually distorted a little bit at an angle and similar to the angle that this person is holding this record album in. I do need to do a little bit of work to be able to get it to line up and fit underneath her thumb and just line up along these edges here. So what I'm going to do is just speed up the video a little bit and go ahead and add a mask, clicking the mask button, and then I will add to this mask and change it here in just a second. This is most definitely not done. There are a few things that we need to add in here, including adding back in the shadow underneath the hand, and we need to roughen the edges a little bit. One other thing that we want to do is try to match the grain and the blur. Now, if you can tell, the photograph that we're mocking up into has a little bit of an ISO setting that's turned up a little bit, depending on maybe the light in the room wasn't very bright. So because of that, there's a little bit of grain on the hand, and the mock-up is much cleaner. So we need to make sure that that matches that grain. To be able to add the grain back in here, what we can do is go to our filter setting and add some noise. I want to make sure I have the picture selected and not the mask. Let's go to filter and noise and add noise. Now what we're trying to do is, if you can tell here, there's a little bit of grain that's showing up. We want to try and match that amount on the mock-up. There's way too much, so that it looks similar. And it's okay if it's not perfect, as long as it looks convincing from a distance. You can bounce back and forth between uniform and Gaussian. All right, let's go ahead and add that shadow back in. What's nice about this is that because we've already done the work of masking out this hand here, I can actually hold down the command button or control on a PC and just click on the mask to be able to make that a selection again. And then what I can do is add a new layer above my album so that I can paint with a brush, a very soft brush, a subtle shadow underneath this hand here. So I'm going to turn down the hardness on my brush to be very soft, and we'll choose kind of a darker gray color and then just go ahead and paint a little bit, maybe turning down the opacity. of the brush as well. I'll just erase any excess that I don't want here, and then change the blending mode. This is going to be my shadow. Change the blending mode to something that will complement that. And it may be if it's a little bit too dark, I can turn down the opacity on the layer as well. See how that looks? Too bad, we can play with it a little bit. The next thing we want to do is roughen these edges a little bit. You can also duplicate this mask by holding down the Option key, clicking and dragging on the mask and dragging it to a new layer. And now anything I paint or draw will share the same mask properties that I've already created. Makes it pretty easy to add some bruises and cuts and torn paper. One key thing about adding texture is it really helps if you are pretty inconsistent. Most things that are kind of random happenings, like that produce texture of worn and things that have been used and well loved, is that they just kind of build up and are very random looking. So if you complement your texture by using lots of different kinds of brushes and then being kind of abstract about where you put them, it may also help a little bit to use different kinds of erasers. Remember, your eraser is also a brush. So if you use kind of a textured eraser as well, you can push and pull that texture as you're putting it onto your mock-up here, making it sure it looks just a little bit more realistic in that sense. You can also change the blending modes of these. Go ahead and make a copy just in case. I'll turn that one off and then just see if there's one that matches, if it's just a little bit closer to something maybe a little bit more subtle. And that looks kind of nice. And of course you can stack these two, offset them a little bit if you want to. And of course if you put things into a folder, the folders themselves can also hold your masks. So if you copy your masks onto the folders, you don't even have to have masks on these at all. Folders are a great way to organize things. Highly recommend labeling your layers as well. There we go. So if I were to need to make any changes to my mask, I would just need to copy it a couple times instead of like 10. Sometimes it's nice to add little dings and things that happened on the surface as well. So I'll try to paint a few little scratches, hairs and things, fragments. Never know when it was put into a backpack with some other items that just kind of scratch the surface of that paper. I'm going to add a little bit too much and then back it away with an eraser. I kind of like to work additively and then subtract to find a good balance. Now last and certainly not least is I need to do a little bit of light editing onto this cover here. If you can tell, there is a light source in this room, probably a window, over here, kind of in the top left. Now the light you can see is casting a pretty bright highlight onto her hands and a little bit on her feet as well. For me to be able to match this, I do need to have a little bit of light reflected onto the surface. Now it is paper that's been printed, theoretically here, and so that just needs to be matched up to the particular light source as well. I do like to do this with paint, so I'm going to go ahead and make a new folder here. This is going to be the light and shadow, and I'll copy my mask so that it all stays onto my album cover. Just drop this new layer into there. This is going to be some highlights. And I go ahead and play around with this. I usually do very, very soft brushes in this case, soft round brushes that are very big and very transparent, and just layer these up to create the effect of light. Now the last thing I might need to do, depending on the picture, is to blur just little sections of it. Most of the time when you take a picture, some things are in focus and some things are not. If you can tell, this girl's feet are pretty out of focus, although her hand looks pretty clear. So it may be that some things that get towards this edge, even though this is on the same plane, may be slightly blurrier than things that are closer to the focus, in this case here. And we can double check that by looking at the original photograph. If there are certain parts that seem less clear than others, then we can try and match that a little bit of blur on it. So let's try and put that down. We're going to do that to our actual rectangle, which is our smart object that contains our artwork in this case. We can go up to the filter and blur gallery and tilt shift. This will give us the option to be able to blur things at an angle. So the center of this pin gives us our clarity, in which case we want to match the clarity location, something similar on the same plane of existence, and then we can choose how blurry things get and where they get blurry with these sections here. And if it's a little bit too much, we can go back to our blur gallery by double clicking under the effects and adjusting it. Alright, looks pretty good. Last couple things I need to do is do some cropping, make sure it's the right size to where I want to post it, and then save it in the right document format. So JPEG is going to be good for being able to post things online. I can double check my image size and save this, making sure that it's a good resolution and a good size. Alright, and there you go. I did return it to its original state before I had downscaled it and saved it as a JPEG. That way, if I ever need to come back and do some more edits, I can, without losing any quality. Well, there you go. Hope that helps. Give it the old college try. Hit me up anytime if you have questions, and as always, stay safe and healthy, everyone.